There are 8 different graphic types in academic task 1. Line graphs, pie charts, tables, bar graphs, stacked bar graphs, process diagrams, map diagrams, and sometimes you might even get more than one graphic. In today's lesson, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about how to tackle pie charts. My name is Eli and I used to be an IELTS examiner. I've evaluated thousands of students' answers and I know what you need to do to get a high score based on the IELTS marking criteria. My IELTS courses have already helped thousands of students score Band 7, Band 8 and even Band 9 in the IELTS test. You can start all of my IELTS courses for free at EnglishProTips.com. In today's lesson, we're focusing on IELTS writing. I'm going to show you the 5 steps to success, how to analyze the graphic, how to write the introduction, the overview and the body paragraphs, and I'm going to show you some useful vocabulary and grammar for when you get pie charts. Now, remember to download the PDF, which contains a checklist that you can use when you're writing your answers. You'll find that below the video. Question: what do you think of the diet in the USA? What comes to mind when you think of a North American breakfast? Well, perhaps you imagine pancakes or waffles. What about lunch and dinner? Personally, I think of pizza, barbecue ribs and burgers. And when you think of snacks, well, I think of snack bars like protein bars and crisps. The problem with a lot of this food is it's kind of unhealthy. It contains a lot of sodium, so a lot of salt. A lot of this food also contains a lot of saturated fats, so they're very high in fat. And a lot of this also contains added sugar, especially the pancakes, waffles, and snack bars. With that in mind, have a look at the pie chart graphic that we're going to look at today. The charts below show the average percentages in typical meals of 3 types of nutrients, all of which may be unhealthy if eaten too much. Average percentage of sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar in typical meals consumed in the USA. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to analyze the graphic. So imagine you get this graphic in your exam. What I'd recommend is you spend 1 to 4 minutes doing this. First of all, think about the categories that are involved. Well, we've got sodium, saturated fat, added sugar, and all of these different meal times. We need to mention all of these essential categories, otherwise we'll get a much lower score. The next thing to do is to think about the largest and smallest proportions. So the largest proportions, well, if we look at sodium, we've got 43% at dinner. If we look at saturated fat, we've got 37% at dinner. And if we look at added sugar, we've got 42% in snacks. So I would make a note of that. I would draw these circles on the graphic itself. And then if we look then at the smallest, we'll notice that for sodium, we've got breakfast. For saturated fat, we've got breakfast. And added sugar, we've got breakfast. So breakfast is actually always the meal with the lowest amount of all of these nutrients. So I would make sure to mention that. Next, I'd look at similar and contrasting patterns. So for example, if we look at sodium, we can see that there's 14% in both snacks and breakfast. And then if we look at 16% for saturated fat at breakfast, and 16% at breakfast for added sugar, I would also make a point of mentioning that. The final thing I would do is to actually rank the order. So for example, I would look at sodium and I'd say, okay, well, dinner is the first, it's the highest percentage, followed by lunch, and then we've got joint third position for breakfast and snacks. Then I'd look at saturated fat and go, okay, dinner, lunch, then snacks, then breakfast. For added sugar, we've got snacks now, then we've got dinner, and then we've got lunch, and then we've got breakfast. Okay, so I would just write all of this on the graphic itself, and I'd pay attention to this. Sodium and saturated fat actually follows a very similar pattern, so I'd make a point of mentioning that in my answer. The final thing I'll do while I'm analyzing the graphic is to think about logical ways to organize the body paragraphs. So what are the logical ways we could organize our answer? Perhaps by meal, or perhaps by nutrient. And if we organize our answer by meal, we'd have, for example, a paragraph about breakfast, one about lunch, another about dinner, and then one about snacks. If we were to look at nutrients, we'd have a paragraph about sodium, then saturated fat, and then added sugar. Now we've analyzed the graphic, it's time to think about how we're going to write our introduction. We're going to use this cheat sheet. The graphic type, then the verb, and then the description. Now this helps us to rewrite the description in our own words. The chart below, okay, let's say the 3 pie charts. Show the average percentages in typical meals of 3 types of nutrients. Presents the average proportions of sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar, all of which may be unhealthy if eaten too much. Nutrients that may be harmful if eaten in excess, consumed during breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks in the USA. Okay, you can see we've made certain changes. For example, in the rubric, we've got the chart below, and we've changed that to 3 pie charts. In the rubric, we've got percentages, and we've said proportions. In the rubric, we've got 3 types of nutrients, and we've named them sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar. In the rubric, we've got unhealthy, and we've used the synonym harmful. In the rubric, we've got too much, and I've changed that to in excess. So we've written a high scoring introduction. If you want to practice writing introductions for a range of different Task 1 graphics, check out my academic Task 1 writing course. I'll show you how to write high scoring answers for any graphic type. You can watch video lessons, read model answers, do quizzes, download PDFs, and even get AI feedback on your answers. You can start for free at EnglishProTips.com. Time to move to the overview. For a pie chart, we need to summarize the main features. So I would point out in my overview that sodium and saturated fat follow a similar pattern and added sugar is somewhat different. So let's say that. Overall, the chart shows that sodium and saturated fat follow a similar pattern across meals, while added sugar is distributed quite differently. Okay, let me point out some parts of this overview. I've started with overall. I always start with overall to make it very clear to the examiner that I've got an overview. I have this nice phrase, follow a similar pattern. That's useful vocabulary to say that it's almost identical or that it's similar. Is distributed quite differently. Now I'm contrasting it with added sugar. I'm saying sodium and saturated fat follow a similar pattern, but added sugar is distributed, is organized quite differently. The next thing I'd point out in this overview is to highlight the highest and lowest figures. This is a very good idea when you get pie charts. So let's do that now. Dinner provides the highest amount of sodium and saturated fat, whereas snacks make up the largest share of added sugar. Dinner provides the highest amounts. The highest amounts, you'll see we've got lots of ranking, lots of comparative, lots of superlatives in this answer. In fact, here's another one. The largest share. When it comes to pie charts, you're often having to show the comparison between different quantities or different amounts of a substance. So phrases like highest amount or largest share are very useful. Now we could end here. That would be a great overview. However, I'm going to increase the score by adding that breakfast consistently accounts for the lowest proportion. So as well as talking about the highest, I'm talking about the lowest proportions as well. And I use this nice phrase, the lowest proportions. Again, a superlative phrase. Now we've written our overview, it's time to go to the body paragraphs. Now I said that there are different logical ways to organize our body paragraphs. We can do it by meal or we can do it by nutrient. And if we're going to do it by meal, we're going to have breakfast, then lunch, then dinner, then snacks. Now these could be 4 paragraphs, that's totally fine. Or we could combine them into 2 paragraphs, which is also fine. We'd maybe just think about which of the categories would be logically linked together. Now, if we're going to group by nutrient, we could have a paragraph on sodium, a paragraph on saturated fat, and a paragraph on added sugar. And again, we could actually combine this into 2 body paragraphs, thinking about which categories could be combined. So in this case, sodium and saturated fat have a similar pattern. It would be logical to include these in 1 body paragraph. However, for this essay, I'm going to write 3 paragraphs and I'm going to organize my body paragraphs by these different nutrients. So let's write body paragraph 1. It's all about sodium. Regarding sodium, dinner represents the largest proportion at 43%, making it the primary source of sodium intake. I start with regarding sodium. I'm showing the examiner that this paragraph is all about sodium. It's very important that it's easy for the examiner to follow the logic of your answer. Again, I use great superlative language, the largest proportion. And here making it the primary source of sodium intake, I use a participle clause, which is a clause to give extra information that we form by adding it to an independent clause with a comma and then an ing verb, so making it the primary source of sodium intake. Let's continue our answer. Lunch ranks second, making up 29%, while breakfast and snacks each account for an identical 14%, the joint lowest figure. Okay, notice that I've organized my body paragraphs into a logical way, and then even within the body paragraph, I've organized the content in a logical way. I'm talking about the highest to the lowest. In this case, I talk about dinner first, and then lunch, and then breakfast and snacks. This kind of logic is very easy for an examiner to understand and will help me to get a higher score for coherence and cohesion. Lunch ranks second. You'll find that there's a lot of ranking language when it comes to pie chart. The joint lowest figure, again, superlative language. Let's now move on to body paragraph 2, where we look at saturated fat. Now, the first thing I'm going to write is a topic sentence to show the examiner that I'm talking about saturated fat. A similar pattern can be observed for saturated fat. Great. A short, concise topic sentence that shows the examiner what they will read about in this paragraph. Once again, dinner constitutes the largest share at 37%, followed by lunch at 26%. Once again, dinner constitutes the largest share at 37%, followed by lunch at 26%. Notice the language. Constitutes the largest share. Constitutes is very useful language when we're talking about the amount of a whole. We can use language like constitutes, makes up, represents, contributes, accounts for. These are great synonyms and useful phrases instead of saying, for example, 29% is lunch, 14% is breakfast. We use this language instead. Now, if you're going to remember two of them, I'd primarily use makes up and accounts for because I think they're the most useful when it comes to looking at pie charts. Snacks contribute a more modest 21%, whereas breakfast records the lowest proportion at just 16%. Snacks contribute a more modest 21%. That's some of the useful language we just looked at. Records the lowest proportion, another superlative. Let's move now to body paragraph 3, which looks at added sugar. The distribution of added sugar differs considerably from the other two nutrients. The distribution of added sugar differs considerably. Even though this is a new paragraph, I'm comparing it to what we've already looked at, sodium and saturated fat. These comparisons help us to get a higher score in IELTS writing. Snacks represent the largest proportion by a wide margin at 42%, almost double the figure for dinner at 23%. Almost double the figure for dinner. Okay. Great language. We're not saying it's double the figure, we're saying it's almost double the figure. And even the fact that we've identified this kind of double the figure shows that a higher level of analysis of the graphic. So we're often looking for times when we can say half or double or 3 times. This helps us to get a higher score and shows a wider range of vocabulary. Lunch contributes 19%, while breakfast once again has the smallest share, representing only 16% of the total. Has the smallest share. Again, great ranking language. Okay, that covers the body paragraphs. I want to show you some useful vocabulary and grammar for pie charts. First of all, some useful verbs. I said earlier, instead of repeating is 25%, there are certain verbs we can use. Things like account for, make up, represent, contribute, constitute. So we can say things like dinner accounts for 43% of sodium intake. Breakfast makes up just 14%. Do you see how this sounds a lot better than just using the verb be? So dinner is 43% of sodium intake. Accounts for 43% of sodium intake sounds much better. Now look at my answer and see how often I use these verbs. Provides, make up, contribute, account for, represent, constitute, records. You can see that I use a lot of this high scoring vocabulary in this model answer, and you can too. Just practice it before your exam. The next thing I want to show you is ranking language. This is especially useful for pie charts. Things like the largest proportion, the highest percentage, the greatest share, the smallest proportion, the lowest figure. You can say things like dinner accounts for the largest proportion at 43%, or breakfast records the lowest figure at just 16%. Now look again at my answer and see how much ranking language I use. Have a look at this. So much ranking language. We've got things like provides the highest amount, make up the largest share, accounts for the lowest proportion. Brilliant. Finally, it's a good idea to learn fractions. This is very useful, especially for pie charts. Now, you'll know, for example, if you see 50%, that's half. 25%, well, that's a quarter. 75%, that's 3/4. 33%, 1/3. 67%, 2/3. That's all fine. However, a lot of the time in IELTS, you don't get these exact easy numbers. You get things like 47%. So what are you going to say? I'd recommend that you identify this as just below half. Or if you get 27%, just over a quarter. Or if 74%, almost 3/4. Around 1/3. For 35%. For 68%, approximately 2/3. Now we can use all of this useful vocabulary, things like almost, nearly, approximately, just above, just below, around, or roughly, when we're describing fractions that are almost 1/3 or just above a half. Okay. Make sure that you download the checklist and use this when you're writing your own model answers. Now guys, what I would recommend is that you write your own answer to this question. I'll put a link to the lesson below this video and you can write your own answers and get AI feedback on your writing. Best of luck with your studies and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye then.